Welcome to ReThink You, bringing you ideas, inspiration, and motivation to start living the life you were created to live. Here is your host, author, trainer, speaker, and coach, and founder of ReThink You, Kim Lovings.
Well, hi, and welcome back to the ReThink You podcast. I'm excited this month to be featuring speakers that I'll be bringing together into a panel discussion about behavioral health for our military, our warriors, and our first responders. I hope you enjoyed the powerful conversation with Joe Smaro in a previous episode. Today, I'm honored and very encouraged to have a conversation with Dr. Shauna Springer, better known as Doc Springer. She is the relationship expert, a trauma expert, a trusted doc. She is also known for pop culture and mainstream insights in psychology and interpersonal relationships, affecting all people, originating from what she gleaned from 2 decades of work at the extremes. Doc Springer is a graduate from Harvard University and is one of the world's leading experts on PTSD, trauma, and moral injury among veterans. She co-hosts a weekly episode on topics like this in collaboration with Military Times, and her work has been featured on multiple media channels. She's also a regular contributor to Psychology Today. Her book, called Warrior, Caring for Those Who Protect and Serve, is just a powerful read, and you'll hear us talk about the book. Doc Springer will soon be releasing a second edition, and we will include information about that in the show notes. So without further ado, let's go to my interview with Doc Shauna Springer. Well, Doc Springer, thanks again for being with us. And as we start this interview, our listeners love to know people's origin stories of how you got started in this work. And I know from reading in your book that your father had a key influence on you, but why don't you tell us your origin story of how you ended up doing what you're doing?
Sure, Kim. Well, it goes way back, I think. And I didn't really figure it out till many years later. It was just sort of putting the pieces together when I started to ask myself on a walk with my sister, why is it that I instinctively like warfighters? What is it about our relationship that just works? And really, we talked about the kind of childhood we had and basically made the connection that it was like a boot camp, like a long version of boot camp. So both of my parents, were, of course, in on this decision to raise us in a certain way that was very much military in its values and discipline. We would get up, very early in the morning and run laps around the track at 5 in the morning, from a very young age, like age 5. We'd be running and then we'd compete in the track meet, wearing shirts that said property of team, my maiden name. And so this and other experiences that we had, being sent to different countries to do mission work from a very young age alone, each of us, I started when I was age 10, became just the stream we were swimming in. I didn't even realize it, right? Now I look back and I think, wow, that was unconventional. That was free range parenting taken to its extreme, when you send your kids abroad to make them unafraid, to build their courage, and to help them understand how do you navigate a different culture that has different values from the ones that are dominant in your main society. So we had all these experiences, and I think it's what helped warriors feel like home to me. And so it wasn't something, I intended to do. I'm not somebody who says, oh, I always knew I wanted to be a psychologist. No, I was going to be an English major. I was an English major. I was going to be a lawyer. I was going to take over the law practice that is part of my family history. And that's not the path I took. And I'm well suited for this work because of those early childhood experiences.
That's fabulous. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I know that you've gone on to do some really powerful work, and I look forward to unpacking that in this conversation today. And so also sort of early in your career as a psychologist, at what point did you find yourself sort of being more focused on the issues of trauma, or more specifically working with veterans? How did that come about?
Yeah, so when I was on my internship year, we did an external rotation. And during that rotation, I went through the Gainesville VA and worked with veterans there. They see veterans, that's their population, of course. And it just was a recognition of a fit with the values and the way of seeing the world that I hadn't felt before. I like working with other, patients and clients, and, had a very successful private practice at one time, seeing entirely civilian patients and corporate leaders. And I do that work as well. But, veterans and our warfighters will always be core to my purpose, no matter what else I do. And so it kind of came about my internship year. And then I spent 8 years to the day working in the VA. I made that decision in advance, kind of in line with my values, that this would be my way to serve those who had served me. It was very much intentional. 2 standard enlistments. I started on April 27th. I ended on April 27th, 8 years later, because that was something I consciously decided to do, knowing that even though there are really great people in the VA, a bureaucratic organization is probably not a great fit for some aspects of who I am and my personality. But I decided, you know what, the Army is not in its bureaucratic nature easy for people either. But they go in there and they serve and they risk their lives, and they deal with the good and the bad. And I'm going to deal with the good and the bad of any large system. There's no perfect situation. So I'm going to do that because this is where I can serve warriors. And so I was there for 8 years, and it just really became something that is just going to be part of my mission. Again, no matter, what other speaking or corporate work I might do in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And that makes complete sense. And I think that you strike me as a person that has that level of intentionality and focus in how you approach your life, as you've just shared. And as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm reading your book, Warrior, and there are some powerful threads and topics and focus areas in that I'd love to unpack a little with you. But one of them, which impressed me, and I think it's unusual, was your willingness to stay open to learn, continually learning, and not just get trapped in your rut of your existing knowledge and sort of having a certain methodology that you use in treating patients that you've just always used and you never think of changing. So talk to us a little about what you've done to make sure that you're continually learning and being willing to make the changes, and what sort of impact does that have on your treatment, particularly of veterans?
Yeah, some of it, I figured out in advance, and some of it I figured out retrospectively. But I guess I realized that in my work with veterans, there were 2 types of providers. And this is not about a license. This is not about having a doctoral degree. There were doctors who walked into that room with a rank that they held. They cherish that rank and they maintain it. And they interact with their patients in a way that communicates, I outrank you, to their patients. And there were docs. There were some docs, and some of them were social workers. It, again, is not about the degree, but it's a philosophy of how you work with and walk with your patients. And, sometimes the most important insights and real epiphanies or realizations are right in front of us, like hidden in plain sight. It's stunning to me in retrospect that we didn't ask ourselves the question many years ago, who am I to this population? How does this population see me based on their past experiences with people like me in my role? And when I asked that question, it was clear that the past interactions that many warfighters have had with psychologists and mental health providers has been in a very different context. Now, this doesn't make those mental health providers unsupportive or wrong at all. There's a lot of good docs that serve in the military health system. However, they serve a different mission than those who bring warriors home from war or from their time in service, including those who never deployed. So the people that serve in the military in a role like mine are really looking at evaluating service members for, are they safe to deploy? Is this somebody that needs to be med boarded out? because of a diagnosis, or can they be deployed and, kind of stay in the stream of what they're doing? So that role comes with a kind of rank and power that psychologists have, which is why they're called wizards, because they can make you disappear from the Marine Corps or the military. And that's not a good thing. Typically, it's kind of a term of affection, but it's often from the root of something that is a power to change your whole military career, remove your firearm, do these things that somebody who's bringing a warrior home or helping them adjust or transition out of the military would not be motivated to do, because that's a very different mission. And I think I realized it's on us to help them understand how the role in the mission is different. Otherwise, of course, by default, they're going to transition in with the same assumption and be so guarded and distrustful of the entire process unless they know this is this mission. It's a very different thing. And then I thought about on the specific level, because I came in for better or worse, maybe now for better, at the time for worse, into the treatment caseload of a provider who is trusted and well respected by his patients. So I was replacing a doc that they trusted, and they hadn't built the trust with me. And so there was a lot of anger about transitioning to a new healer. Could they trust me? Could I walk with them in their valleys and really listen without judgment to anything they needed to tell me? And it took some time to build that trust. So thinking about who I am generally, and then who I am in the context of that specific relationship, coming in and coming in at a deficit of trust was critical as a starting point, to not feel like I have this degree, I have this expertise. Why are you not compliant with my treatment plan? Because I know what I'm doing and I'm here to help you. So let's align around my expertise rather than the work you want to do for yourself.
Right. That is so powerful, because I know that, as you say in the book, that one of the quotes I loved is that trust is the most important currency you can earn, or you earn as a healer. Let's camp on trust for a moment and say, what were some specific things that you did that earned you your trust, Doc Spring? And I also wanted to ask you to speak to the difference between a doctor and a doc, because I think you alluded to it, but I'd love you to unpack it for our listeners so that they know where you're coming from on what the term doc means to our warriors.
Sure. So one of the things I did to build the trust was I modified our standard assessment tools. I asked all the standard assessments as required by my job, because that's a form of clinical reminder that you have to do in that healthcare system. And then I added to them. So the original measures stayed, intact. All those questions were asked just as they were put to people, but I added a supplemental measure that had a few purposes. And the supplemental measure had several questions in it that speak to the peak experiences of service, or experiences that many providers don't understand. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of the peak experiences was feeling very close to people that you serve within the military in a way that's hard for you to imagine, even with really, your best friends from before, or having a feeling of feeling a sense of comfort or a thrill from the sounds of heavy artillery or outgoing fire. Will give people like a thrill of pleasure, because it's protection. It's a stand-in for, outgoing fires, protecting them on a base. Or things like feeling like it would be fun to have a fight, like a fist fight, because it would feel good to fight someone, talking about aggressive instincts, or seeing things other people don't see or hear. Even though you know what you're seeing or hearing isn't real, you still have these experiences where you see the flash of an enemy combatant out of the corner of your eye. The reason I asked these questions, some of them were about peak experiences, because I wanted to communicate in that way. You can tell me anything. This greatly expands the range for our conversations therapeutically. So I'm not just like maybe other psychologists in my previous position on a hunt for your problems. I'm not hunting for your deficits here. And the places where you're struggling, I'm honoring and acknowledging that there were also peak life experiences, that you learned things, that you had a bond of trust that is hard to put into words, and that you have some experiences that may be unusual, but they don't mean you're crazy. So seeing people that weren't really there was a common experience for my patients. And I tracked this symptom in about 36 patients, 18 of them, so about half, had that experience. And I think it's because they weren't sleeping at night. You know, you will see things if you're not sleeping at night and you have unresolved moral injury, survivor guilt, and other traumas. So your brain will create images or sounds. You might hear a voice whispering in Farsi. You know, that was another variant of that. And I wanted warriors to know this is common. You're not crazy, and this is not you losing your mind. This is not true psychosis. Your mind is sound. We have some things we need to address and face head on. And when we do that, often these experiences will fade.
Excellent. I love that. And you've actually sort of opened the door for me to ask that question, you know, that the treatment and behavioral health of people like our military, our veterans, but also first responders and others is not isolated to just PTSD. And I think that that's a problem that civilians take, where we kind of lump all our people into that bucket saying, well, anyone who's been in action must be suffering from PTSD and that's their issue. And you talk about other traumas and specifically the term invisible wounds of war. So before I sort of unpack the great work that you're doing with Stella, let's just stay with the military for a moment and say, talk to us a little about those invisible wounds and what are things that we don't know, that not everything is PTSD or TBI even.
Sure. So the concept of invisible wounds of war is not my concept. And let me see if I can answer your previous question, because you asked me to reflect a bit more on what a doctor is and what a doc is. Let me see if I can merge these two here. So invisible wounds of war, it's not my concept. It's typically referred to as PTSD and TBI. So post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injuries are seen as the, quote, invisible wounds of this current war. And that is helpful in a sense that it puts, it makes those things real, right? They're not in your head. And it brings attention to those things as worthy of treatment and worthy of us to address those injuries, even though you can't see them with the naked eye. And my argument has been that for so many of my patients, the invisible wounds of war were not those things, or those were not the things most directly related to their mental crises, to their suicidality and whatnot. So a doc would be somebody who is kind of socialized in that expertise that we gain when we go to school for a really long time. And they think they know what they know. And they think, oh, warriors must be traumatized by what they see and do in war, because that's what would traumatize me, they're thinking. And that must be the focus of where the work needs to be. So we're going to focus on treating those invisible injuries of war from the horrors of exposure to war. And that was not it for so many of the warfighters and warriors I've served. For some of them it was, but for many of them, the more invisible injuries, the more lethal injuries were actually things that they almost never talk about, even in clinical spaces that are supposed to be safe for them. So things like survivor guilt, moral injuries, guilt and shame, the grief of losing people you love like family to combat, training accidents, and suicide. The burden of grief that nobody is helping them to shoulder with insights and support around that. And relationship traumas, relationship rage and conflict and, divorce, difficulties in attachment with their children. Losing access to their children when they get divorced was a huge risk factor for mental health crises and suicide, but we don't talk about those things. So Warrior, how to support those who protect us, is based on the premise that the things that are most directly related to suicide in the warfighter community are things we are failing to address in our traditional approaches. And so it builds out a range of new insights and really helps people understand those and meaningfully address them in ways that are aligned with veterans' culture, values, and language. And that's what a doc does. A doc will sit down with somebody and say, let me put aside what I think I know and just listen deeply and totally non-judgmentally to the pain you need to share with me. Let me see if together I can help you understand and I can understand what is eating you alive, what is at the root of your mental health battle. And then once I understand that, let's develop a plan that works for you, that's based on your goals, your values, who you are, and what motivates you, not based on, a priori menu of this is what I offer and you can have this therapy or that therapy. It's no, I'm going to know who you are and I'm going to walk with you as a doc. And I'm going to just walk next to you and take you through this process and help bring you back to a place of health and healing. That's the difference between a doc and a doctor.
That's powerful. Thank you so much for explaining that. And I think, as I said, when I listen to you, I get so absorbed and I can think of so many things to ask. So let me just try and stay on course here. But you have mentioned the issue of moral injury a few times, and I think it would be important for you to unpack that, because I certainly know how instructive it was for me to read the book and learn about these things. And as you've just alluded to, that some of these moral injuries and those conditions are more to blame for the crises. So perhaps unpack some of the patterns of those that you've seen that are most common in a little more detail.
Okay, sure. I'll give you a bit more on that. So originally, moral injury was cast as something that you do or can't do that is not aligned with your moral code. So the original understanding of that was things like atrocities of war. Milai would be an example. That's not aligned with the warrior code. And so there was some really pioneering work by Jonathan Shea and others to bring that concept to the light. Really important, because it's not the same thing as PTS. A lot of people conflate the two, and they're very different things, and they need a very different treatment approach. Just as grief and trauma need a very different treatment approach. I don't think we understand these critical differences. So PTS, post-traumatic stress, is feeling unsafe as you navigate the world and feeling like you can't trust other people and they're not safe. So that's post-traumatic stress. Moral injury is a feeling of being somehow morally tainted or contaminated and therefore unworthy of belonging or love or membership in the tribe. So that's a different thing. And the original understanding of it as atrocities of war, unfortunately for some people, has really given it kind of stigma, because they say, I don't moral injury. I didn't do anything that was outside of my warrior code, right? So that doesn't apply to me. And so it can be off-putting. What I'm trying to do is build on the work of pioneers like Jonathan Shea and others and expand the aperture of our understanding. Because what I know is that just surviving when people you love like family die shifts the entire moral framework of your life at that point and ever after. So what happens is I really will unpack this in my book much more fully. But one example is that people will lose a brother or sister in arms, whether to combat or a training accident or suicide. And let's say that they lose somebody to combat. So suddenly somebody who is in their full health and youth gets taken out by a sniper or whatever, and they get med evacuated from the combat zone, and there's like this severed grief, like cut off grief. And that was somebody you love like family. And then let's say that in the transition out of the military, you struggle, like many people do. Many people, it's a punch in the gut. So you struggle during military transition, and what happens is so many of the warriors I serve will go back in their mind to say, who am I that's worthy to live when a person who is a true warrior, who never would have had a problem holding down a job, never would have yelled at his kid, never would have, made his wife have that look of fear on her face, when she felt threatened by him, never would have had an issue with drinking like I am having. Why am I worthy to survive when somebody that worthy who would not have done those things has died? And so people would essentially so frequently compare themselves to the ghost of the person they lost. And that's why I say that it shifts the entire moral framework of your life. That comparison process then can drop you into a very negative, dangerous spiral of thinking that you are the threat that needs to be taken out. And as soon as a warrior drops into that, that is a really problematic thing in terms of suicidal thinking and self-destructive intent. And so again, like I fully unpack this in my book. I want people to read the book, share the book, get it out. But that's a little sample of kind of where that line of thought develops in those insights.
Excellent. That's a great explanation. Thank you so much. And as I said, I'm doing this so that it entices people to read the book, because the book is just phenomenal. And I'm excited that you're bringing out a new edition of the book. So for now, though, I'm just going to, take a slightly different tack and say, I know that you are doing powerful work in the area of trauma with Stella. And for those of you who don't know, Stella is America's fastest growing network of trauma treatment centers, of which Doc Springer is the chief of psychology. So I think you're doing powerful work there. And I'm excited because, being a thinking coach myself, I talk to people about how much of our thinking drives behavior, but the thinking can become ruts in the brain in a good way or bad way. And when you've got a rut in the brain of a way of thinking, in order to reprogram that pathway, sometimes takes disconnecting the emotion from the pathway, because the stronger the emotion, the more likely that rut is embedded in the brain. And the breakthrough work that you're doing, specifically at Stella, but just in general, with being able to help people resolve those patterns in the brain, or that what I call those triggers of automatic behavior in response to a stimulus, is fascinating to me. And I know I'm not the only one who's going to geek out about this. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about the work that Stella is doing?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So Stella is the fastest growing network of PTSD focused clinics in America, or trauma more generally, whether you have a diagnosis or not. We have 19 clinics now in America and 2 in Australia launching. And so that's just within, less than a year. And what we do is innovative treatments for trauma, especially the stellate ganglion block is kind of one of our leading treatments. It is the injection of an anesthetic medication that's not psychoactive, very short amount of downtime, and no long-term side effects. But it reboots the adrenaline system. So it takes you from a state of being in chronic threat response, chronic sort of fight or flight, and gets you calm again in your own body. And this came out of the anesthesiology community, Dr. Eugene Lipov. There have been other pioneers as well. Down in Fort Bragg, Dr. Jim Lynch, Dr. Sean Mulvaney, Dr. Brian McLean out at Tripler Army Medical Center has done many thousands of these as well. And so in the military context and through Dr. Lipov's work, they have really all taught me that PTS is a biological injury, causes a biological injury that's maintained by changes in how we think and behave. And that's where the psychology or coaching part comes in. So I'm the kind of person who will churn on an issue and churn and think and think and think until it like starts to make sense to me. And the big thing that was a realization around that is that for so many years, I've been doing therapy with people who were in the wrong mind state. They're in the wrong mind state because when you have a fight or flight system that's chronically locked on, you have difficulties concentrating. You're not sleeping. I mean, even not sleeping can affect your energy and your cognitive fluency, right? And therapies work. It requires you to go back in time, revisit your thoughts, pattern new behaviors off of new thoughts. It's a lot of work. It's exhausting. And you cannot really integrate insights when you're not in the right mindset. So the big sort of epiphany for me was to think about, how does this work in a different field? Well, if you went into an oncologist to get the results of a cancer test, they would tell you to bring a friend. And they would tell you to bring a friend because they know that if they said the words, "I'm sorry you have cancer," you're not going to hear anything else after that. And so you bring a friend to take good notes. And here I am with all the other trauma psychologists and healers in America and elsewhere, trying to have sessions with people that have just sort of been in this mind state of, "I'm sorry you got cancer." They're out of their minds with stress and adrenaline and the fight or flight. And so the big epiphany for me was, if you address the biological aspect of trauma and you get people calm in their own body, the work you do can take on a whole new traction. And that's how it's worked. So I've treated about 50 patients. And once they're calm, I can go in and say the same doggone thing I've said to them 5 times before. And now they hear it. And now they can integrate it. And now they start behaving differently with their wife, with their kids. Now they start pushing out and reclaiming territory in their lives that they couldn't do when they were in that fight or flight stage. And it's critical to combine or fuse biological and psychological, because otherwise the effect is a bit like a Reebok pump. You get people calm, the adrenaline comes back. They have to take that window of opportunity and change the thinking and behavior if they're to experience long-term relief. And so that's where thought restructuring, psychologists, therapists, healers, coaches, that's where people come in and they do the work to help maintain the gains that people can get from this incredibly innovative procedure.
That is fascinating. And as I mentioned before we started recording, I'm actually sort of referencing that in a book that I'm writing right now, because it's such an important understanding for individuals to help separate those two. And the fact that we have discovered how to do that biologically is just incredible. Anything else that you want to talk about in terms of what Stella is doing? Because I mean, to open that number of centers just in the last year is quite remarkable, Dr. Springer. Would you say that it was related to or exacerbated by the pandemic, or were they just mutually exclusive circumstantial events just happened to happen in the same time period?
Well, we launched before the pandemic, just before, and that would have really made less brave people than our funders and leaders really think twice. But this is a mission for all of us to really create a world where no person suffers from trauma. And then we saw the pandemic hit, and we saw this year of trauma unfold. And then it gave the mission an entirely new urgency. So we have scaled up across America and into Australia, and we'll continue, I'm sure, to scale up to meet the needs of all Americans, make this treatment and other innovative treatments available to all people. Not only that, but I spent a good part of this year developing about 10 or 12 educational videos that will help coaches and therapists and psychologists who are all across America learn about what this is and how to prepare patients for this before, during, and after. And so these will be free. And this is something that Stella is doing because we don't do the therapy in-house. We partner with providers and coaches across the country to provide combined care. So we have an aspect of the patient journey, which is address the biological symptoms with a precision medicine approach. And then we work with providers. And it was very important to us that we work with providers in a way that's meaningful, where they are educated about what we do and how to best, take people through that process, because they're going to be doing the work to change the thinking and behavior. So that's probably going to release, I think, in the next month or two, and it will be free of charge. And it'll go out and help us really, kind of come together in a kind of, as my friend Doc Lynch says, medicine is a team sport. And it will really, I think, be a force multiplier for all the people that are doing good work in this innovative trauma space.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much for that, because it's something that piques my interest. So we'll talk more about that offline, because I'm one of those thought restructuring coaches. And we've just unpacked some interesting topics here, Dr. Springer. And I thank you for your time. But as we sort of come in for the close, are there any additional nuggets that you'd like to share with the listeners that perhaps you wished I'd asked that I hadn't asked about?
Well, there's one thing I wish I had said, and then I'll answer your question. The other thing is that it's not just therapy, but it's really helping people learn how to regulate their own body state as well. So a mutual friend of ours, John McCaskill, does incredible work in the mind-body space around mindfulness meditation. And so partnering with people like John and Stella's partnered with Connected Warriors, and they do yoga. They have a VA contract, so we're partnered with them. And we really believe it's, treat the biological, that's the primer before the paint. And then you do the therapy or coaching, that mind body stuff as well. Is those three are how we get people long lasting positive outcomes. Okay, so last thoughts, I would say that if you meaningfully are wanting to understand and support our nation's warriors and their families, who also are traumatized and often go through many of the same challenges that warriors do, then really that's the labor of love that my work is about. And my book is going to come out April 27th, Warrior: How to Support Those Who Protect Us. It's got 100 new pages of content. In this last year, my husband will tell you, I've been writing like Hamilton, just with an urgency. And I've done, 100 articles, interviews, podcasts in the last year alone. And so I picked 10 of my favorites, and I'm adding that into my new edition, as well as many new exercises. And the point of these new exercises will be to help healers and those they serve, to include coaches, create that deeper trust that they need, because the first story you hear is not the story you need to understand. The first story is a test of trust. Can I trust you to walk with me in the valleys? And unless you build that trust and earn that trust with those you support, you'll never hear the things that you need to know about if you're going to help warriors become well and as strong and a part of our society as we need them to be.
Very good advice indeed. Well, Doc Springer, I know that your work is powerful. I'm going to make sure that we have both the image of the book on this recording as well as the information on when people could buy the new edition, which will be coming out right before we publish this podcast. So it'll be on the market and available when you are watching or listening to this. And thank you again for your time. As I said, I'm continuing to learn so much from you.
Thank you for having me, Kim. I really enjoyed it. Great questions today.
Thank you.